Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I think it's just about 2 o'clock. So thank you for joining us. We are still seeing many people join the chat, but we decided to start at 2 o'clock as the meeting was called for. As many of you were probably on our previous session, we have done some great work in our digital council over the last year, which is chaired by Arthur, who will introduce the panel today as well as the discussion that we're having around really the future of work, the future of banking, the future of fintechs, financial services in general. And I think that part of what we're trying to do now is to share some of these learning with our client base and with people who've got an interest in what we're doing, as well as to engage with experts from across a wide range of industries who have got some deep insights into how much the world is changing. I just want to make a couple of points. The one is that obviously, while thinking about the future, I think it's important to be very empathetic to the realities of the moment we're in. And as we see the corona numbers, the infection rates just increasing at an alarming rate in the country, obviously our thoughts and our prayers go out to all those families who are being impacted either directly or indirectly by corona, as well as to the many people who are suffering in terms of their jobs, their businesses, in terms of the huge economic impact that this virus is having on us as a country and obviously is having in the world. And we just see how volatile the world has become in the last few months. We're already quite volatile coming into this year. And obviously it's a time where a lot of people are going through very difficult challenges. And while there are so many exciting opportunities that emerge out of digitization and the fourth industrial revolution, which has really been the focus of the work of the Digital Council, it would be wrong really not to reflect on the challenges and the realities of the moment that we're in at the moment. I sit on the Banking Association board, and from there we can just see the impact that this virus is having on so many businesses and so many people. And we obviously see that in our own client base. And I think that it's going to require all of us, in terms of thinking about our own futures and thinking about the futures of our clients, to really adopt a very open mind, a future look, and to take some difficult decisions today and to embrace change, which I think is the key element at this point. We're very fortunate to have Iraj and Nicola join us. We've got a long association with both of you. I'll let Arthur introduce both of you, but thank you very much. It's always good to see you, even in this virtual manner. And we appreciate the time, and obviously we appreciate the leadership roles that you play in our society. And Arthur, once again, just thank you for everything you're doing for SASFIN and for the broader country, in terms of your thinking and reflections around how the world is changing and how technology can be used to our advantage. And on that note, I'll hand over to Arthur, but thank you all for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the session.
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor to have Iraj and Nicola with us on the panel today. Iraj heads up Pan-African Capital Holdings, and Nicola is Dean of Gordon Institute of Business Science, which is part of the University of Pretoria. And it's been amazing to watch your insights over the years into the economy and into the world of work. And this is why we thought it would be ideal to have you with us on this Digital Council panel today. Just for background on the Digital Council, the idea was to provide a platform for guidance of the market entering an era of digital transformation, especially in financial services. So we don't believe we have all the answers, but we always felt that by providing a platform for those who can help unravel this digital environment, what we saw as digital change, and now it's digital acceleration, and also then to give a sense of where markets are going, where industry segments are going, and what are the ways that organizations and people are embracing to integrate these changes into the way they operate and the way they work. Because it's not going to be a case of this is exactly what we have to do now for tomorrow. It's a case of we have to keep evolving to embrace the constantly emerging future. So in that context, I want to introduce today's discussion by talking about what has been a real buzzword and in fact became quite an unpopular term because of being a buzzword for selling products and services in technology, and that is digital transformation. But the reality is that is exactly what underpins those organizations that are adopting or rather adapting to the pandemic and the crisis that it has created. So those companies that are digitally transformed have been in the best position to respond, and those that are currently transforming themselves in terms of their digital processes and operations are the ones who are adapting most quickly. So that's the broad context. My argument is that digital transformation has been happening all the time, and that we have all been part of that, whether knowingly or unknowingly, because of being customers of organizations that are digitally transforming or participating in their processes. What I believe has happened now is that we have seen an awakening to digital transformation rather than that we've seen the arrival of digital transformation. And for that reason, I refer to it as digital awakening. And that digital awakening is something that we're all experiencing, whether it's because we're shopping for groceries regularly for the first time, or whether our organizations are operating remotely and via digital channels. We've all awoken to the fact that this is now part of our lives and it's not going to go away. So the big question that then emerges is, as everyone becomes digitally awake, so to speak, how does that change the way the economy evolves, and also how the economy has to embrace this digital awakening? And I cannot think of a better person to start off addressing that question than Iraj Iberian, who has been commenting on economic issues for longer than I've been commenting on digital issues. So he has the experience and the very deep insight to be able to give us a sense of what we can learn from the past that we can take into this fast emerging future. Iraj, can I turn to you to unpack where the economy is likely to go from this point of view?
Thank you very much, Arthur, and thank you, Sasvin and Michael, for inviting me for this session. The impact of digitalization, much like its predecessors in the forms of industrialization, automation, is a change ultimately in the structure of the economy. And by that, let me give you examples. Whilst we know at the macro level it increases productivity, it also disrupts production. It destroys some of the enterprises. It destroys some of the old jobs that we are used to, some of the modus operandi or operational protocols of the economy, at the same time that it creates new enterprises. It creates new jobs, new careers, and new ways of doing commercial activities. So this process of destruction, creation simultaneously ultimately takes the economy to another level. If we use today's parlance that we all have gotten used to over the past 5 months, the same way that viruses mutate, technology, digitalization speeds up the rate at which the economy mutates from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. This mutation is driven by the pace of technology digitalization in this particular age. What the economists call it the deepening of new technology, or digitalization in this case. So deepening, for example, to just give it a practical example, 5-6 years ago, we were all excited that our cell phones are now smartphones. That was where it started. Now, the next level of it, robots came in the manufacturing. So there are manufacturers, if you go outside Pretoria in Roslyn, the BMW production factory has got nobody in the factory floor, nobody. Neither are skilled or unskilled. Everything is digitalized. You can then go further down. Today, farming and mining are at a rate deepening the application of digitalization technologies and production processes that we've never seen before. And that's what I mean by deepening. We haven't got time, but I guess you get the thread of my thinking that every sphere of economic activity, the way that we are used to, is going to be subjected, if you like, disrupted by the deepening of digitalization. Of course, the most obvious one now, we see that even borders have been destroyed by digitalization. We sit here conferencing, we don't need visas, we don't need police controlling our entry and exit, we just click in and click out. That again, a type of economic activity, connectivity, exchange of views, exchange of knowledge, etc., etc. So in a few years' time, whether it will be 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, remember industrial revolution took about 60, 70 years to take roots in the global economy. Digitalization has taken less than 10 years to speed up, and that's the difference. That's why it's unsettling. So from a social point of view, related to the changing structure of the economy, and the faster this mutation or structural change takes place, the more unsettling becomes from a social political point of view. Because when we destroy jobs, people's careers, people's enterprises, people's dreams are destroyed. And if they cannot adjust, or if the society is not set up to help them to adjust to the new changing production processes, it becomes very, very disturbing and in essence leading to disparities of access, disparities of income, disparities of wealth. And therefore, I'll come back very shortly to the importance of public policy and the speed with which public policy should respond, as opposed to ignore, neglect, or deny the reality of digitalization. So the unsettling part of change is an important part of this deepening technological revolution or digitalization that we witness. Typically, in such phases, from a social point of view, it's the older generations who are less flexible, less attuned to the new technology, or less open to change. The younger generations see it much quicker. They are flexible, typically, if they have the opportunity. And that has to do with the removal of barriers of access. A good example of it is in South Africa. I mean, we've had for the past 10 years, we've been talking about the spectrum and digitalization and broadband. 6, 7 ministers have come and gone, and we're still talking about it. The president, with all his vision, he has promised and he hasn't delivered on it. So, and yet there are countries who have seen it. They've got the ability, and not just political will, but institutional capacity to do what needs to be done to move quickly. And that brings me to my concluding remarks, that in this context, the role of public policies is really pivotal. Of course, governments themselves are not immune to the negative aspects of digitalization. Many governments have lost their revenue base through these changes that takes place in terms of online trading, online conferencing, online everything, and increasing and deepening. And that has essentially to do with the fact that, as economists call it, there is always a lag between, by the time technicians in the public sector realize, the society gets concerned, politicians take it easy or take it seriously, and they eventually do something about it, well, the horse has bolted in many cases. So, and that is the issue, that is there's a mismatch between the speed of digitalization and the speed with which public policy can respond in the age of digital revolution. And in the past, it was bad when governments were slow to respond. These days, it's just mission critical. Many societies lose out. Arthur, I stop at that, and then we can engage with some of these issues. I don't want to go on and on. It's a very rich area in terms of economic activities to explore. hopefully we'll come back to some of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Iraj. Those were some great insights. I love the concept of the deepening of digital transformation. So I have my awakening, you have your deepening, and the combination of those two kind of multiplies the significance of this transformation and also the imperative on policy initiatives to take advantage and to pursue this transformation. Just as a matter of interest, I've counted 10 ministers of communication since digital migration was first announced. And that gives us a sense of how dysfunctional policymaking is in that particular area. And then coming to Nicola Klein, I've participated in many of your events at GIBS over the years, and almost always related to the technologies underlying digital transformation. So I think the last one was artificial intelligence, for example, and how companies should embrace artificial intelligence. Those were always nice to haves. They were imperatives, but it was a sense that we had to convince organizations that they had to use these. Now there's no convincing. Now everyone knows there's an awakening, as we were saying, and a deepening of these needs. So from your perspective, what impact will this have on the need to educate the workforce of the future, but also how the workplace of the future will be transformed as a result?
Thank you, Arthur. It's lovely to see you here and to be part of this panel. So I was struck when Iraj was talking, and as I would absolutely expect from Iraj with his macroeconomic perspective, he starts with this bigger picture and this question of how country policy has to evolve, and particularly, you know, the regulatory environments, the investments that are made at a national level in tandem with the world. But there's another way that I think we have to see both at the same time, complementarity, and that is about individuals. That's about you and me. And how we find ourselves in these changes. Because on one hand, one wants to look at the big picture and how that's shifting. But at the end of the day, this is ultimately going to be about human beings being willing to stop, to unlearn, because we can't just automatically program on top of what we already know. So we actually have to almost deprogram as individuals and then to relearn. I'm hearing no audio, but I think I can be heard. Arthur, can you just confirm that I'm being heard? I see that there's a comment that says no audio. Fantastic, thank you. I always get a bit nervous when that happens, that I might have left it suddenly on mute. So this question about what then has to play out across these multiple levels of society, what is going to play out absolutely at national level, what's going to play out across sectors, and of course part of these conversations have been focusing on what the digitization journey might mean in the financial services sectors. But for everybody who's on today, there are fundamental changes that digitization brings to industry sectors, to, I would argue, business models, and we've seen that accelerate in certain industries, whether that's going to be music, whether it's going to be entertainment, whether it's going to be the hospitality industry. What is playing out in terms of organizational operating models. So in other words, what I speak about there is the fact that we may still be engaging with clients in very similar ways, and you mentioned this, Arthur, but what's playing out on the back end and the extent to which we are able to digitize the production processes, for example, that Iraj referenced now at Roslyn. But ultimately, what this is going to boil down to is individuals and the question of how much change we can assimilate. Now, I think we cannot possibly talk about how the digitization journey is changing without thinking about the global impact of COVID-19 and this pandemic and what that means for us as a species. And as something that is an absolute jolt to the system, where we've certainly seen, I think, the enlightened and people who are thought leaders like yourself, Arthur, in this particular area, be prescient about how digitization is going to impact. I think there's been a significant number of us who perhaps are a little more laggard in this regard, and who kind of have suspected, well, maybe the clever people are going to sort this out. In some organizations, it's been left very much to individuals who might be working in IT, who may not actually have the driving force in terms of the changes that are going to be required across multiple strategic areas of the business. So when we start thinking about what this pandemic means now, on one hand, it's absolutely devastating. And I really appreciate the comments that Michael made in the beginning around the impact that it's having on businesses. But when we do experience these systemic jolts, I think it's a remarkable opportunity to, number one, we're able to because of the changes, actually, where it's easier for us to adopt a position of naive learnership. And I mean, let me explain what I mean by that, using simply this phenomenon that we're all on today of Zoom. For many, the notion of having a digital meeting or a digital conference was just something that they weren't ready to embrace. It would happen at some point, it wasn't happening now. COVID-19 comes along and we are forced into this. And whether we feel stupid, whether we know what we're doing or not, we have to go on that journey. And we have to learn fast. So we have to be open to making some mistakes. We have to be open to trying new things. But if we don't, we're going to absolutely get left behind. The other piece that I think is really important to this, beyond a learning mindset, is this question of where do we as human beings fit in this journey. So it's incredible on one hand to look at what the digital journey as being a function of what it is that technology is able to achieve. But ultimately, any digitization or digital journey is going to be a function of how human beings can change. And that question is happening against a backdrop of extreme volatility. Iraj has already mentioned the socioeconomic impacts and the socio-political impacts, let's say, of digital transformation. And so I think when it comes to, and this may be a long answer to your question, but I'm getting to this question of this world of work. When we come to the world of work and we start saying, what does the future workplace look like? What skills are we going to need? We are of the opinion at Gibbs that on one hand, it's absolutely critical for anybody who comes to campus on a learning journey, whether that's going to be a 30-minute presentation or whether that's going to be a doctoral program. We have to include the changing impact of technology, just as 150 years ago or longer, you could not think about what industrialization meant. But if we ignore what it means to be at our best as human beings in this digital environment, we're going to be missing a trick. And so dealing with issues around uncertainty, fear, change, compassion, the ability to form close social relationships, because as a human species, we actually function at our best when we feel more socially secure. If we ignore that at our peril. And I think we're seeing particularly now, if we look at the outbreaks against racism that are happening internationally, and of course our own experience with Colin Causa and far deeper experiences of racism prior to that, one cannot have a digital universe and a human universe that don't function and actually start coming together. Because if we can't knit those changes, if we cannot lead with an awareness of what the human experience of becoming digital is, I fear that we will move far more slowly and we will start seeing social unrest pushing. I want to emphasize one more thing that I think is really very, very important in our society in South Africa. We know that we are sitting in the country with, if not the highest, but certainly one of the highest inequalities. We know that the impact and the economic impact, forget about digitization for a moment, but the economic impact of COVID-19 is going to exacerbate that. So too is the impact of digitization likely to do that, because those who are the most vulnerable are those who are the lesser skilled and those who are the unemployed. So when we think about worlds of work, if we only think about worlds of professionals, white-collar workers, knowledge workers, and how they need to adapt, I fear that we will be missing out on the majority of our society. And if we don't take into account that adaptation as well, I think it's a recipe for increased unrest. So we've got to look across the bigger picture, not just as what it might mean for you or I as knowledge workers. My final point is about who has to learn. We speak about graduates who are coming into the workplace. I am less concerned, I'm very concerned in terms of job prospects, but I'm less concerned about the graduates who are coming into the workplace and their skills. What concerns me far more is the unlearning that's going to need to happen for all of us. You, me, anybody, particularly on the other side of 50, and I'm on that bad side of 50, there's far more work to be done for us. So where we are used to being the learned, we are not the learned. We have an enormous amount of learning to do. Arthur, I'm going to stop there and open up or take questions as they're asked specifically. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. That was a superb insight as well, and especially the idea that the human must meet the digital. And this is something that has come up repeatedly in our research as well, is that all the big changes that are coming are going to come not because they are digital shifts, but because they shift the way the human is able to interact with digital. So I fully endorse that perspective. But Iraj, coming back to you, what does that mean for our policymakers and our economy? Are we ready for this? What do policymakers have to do in order to, firstly, embrace digital transformation, but secondly, in the context of what Nicola was saying, to bring on board those who are not part of the digital economy or even the regular economy?
Yeah, I think it's a really pertinent question, Arthur, this issue. And my view is that it depends how we see technology. I fully agree with Nicola's fear that if we don't move, we can exacerbate disparities. At the same time, I'm excited by the prospect that if we do the right thing, we actually can flatten some of those historic curves of disparities. For example, let's just be a little bit out of box. If tomorrow, for whatever reason, the cabinet decides together with the industry that we will introduce a broadband that is suitable for the 21st century, not what we have now, we would create reliability, access, and at the extreme, make it a public good. Make it available to everybody in the rural and the urban and in between. What would it do? Suddenly, those who are sidelined by the historic access to opportunities, they can sit wherever they sit and they have communication. We're talking, Nicola mentioned about human psyche. Human psyche is, at a spiritual level, is enriched by being able to reach to the family and to the friends and to those who you care for. Now, if we allow access, suddenly welfare of the society will improve. If we allow access and digitalize at the speed needed and combine that with education, which you can do it now online. You don't have to be in Johannesburg to get the best of best. If you combine it with basic healthcare, that you can sit in your lounge, and if you have access and digital, reliable digital connectivity at a reasonable price or at no price, then suddenly you have a lot of input which matters for your life that yesterday you couldn't get. Now, what should the government do? Government should start thinking about this way. We've got to remove historic barriers that creates disparities of income, and more importantly, or as importantly, disparities of welfare. And therefore, along these lines, link it with the education system. We can't wait until another 5 years of having a sort of older style education system. We cannot have older style public health facilities. We cannot have older style policing facilities, and so on and so on and so forth. And by the way, we can't have older style cabinet behavior. We cannot have ministers getting paid and being chauffeured around at my taxpayers' expense without providing anything to the society. We can watch them, we see them. They used to watch us, we can watch them. So the game has changed, the structure of power has changed. Therefore, governments, also in my view, should begin a social discourse, a political discourse, an economic and welfare discourse along these lines, and bring in a new dispensation.
Thanks, Iraj. Nicola, would you like to comment on the workplace impact or the workplace responsibility and what organizations have to do to respond to this particular question in the same context that Iraj was mentioning with regard to governmental responsibility?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I did want to just comment on what Iraj was saying, because I think there's we really need to leapfrog as a country. And if there's ever going to be an opportunity for somebody to move from being on the back foot to being on the front foot, it's through leveraging digital transformation. And so when we start talking about government, there is this, I do want to comment there, because the critical issues of allocating spectrum, it was quite remarkable to me that when we went into lockdown, suddenly more spectrum could be released after requests for this for years. And I don't know enough about the spectrum numbers, but certainly it was indicative that this was a lack of political will. And by the same token, the opportunity to transform government in terms of its functionality, we only need to look at case studies of countries that are not particularly wealthy. We spent time with an MBA group a couple of years ago in Estonia. And for me, that was just fascinating, looking at how a civil service could be digitized, and all of the inequalities and the indignities of having to spend time as a citizen standing in queues, dealing in environments, and having to travel miles and miles to access those environments, one can really leapfrog over. So I think it's absolutely critical that at a country level we start relooking that, and from a national perspective. I think in terms of our workplaces, I mean, obviously the whole question about remote working has become front and center for all of us because of the national lockdown. What is fascinating about remote working is that when you do couple it with the kind of infrastructural changes that Iraj is talking about, I want to propose, I'm not sure whether I have the argument right, but I think that the impact of our geospatial inequalities could be reduced. Because where you currently have individuals who have to travel many kilometers to get to work, you have to navigate inadequate public transport, where they are able to do those jobs digitally, that paves a way for, I think, enormous opportunities. What it leaves out, of course, are those who are employed in jobs that are where digitization is not quite, they can't necessarily work from home. And so our questions of how to solve those, I don't think, other than the embracing of digitization that makes us more competitive as a country, that increases the tax nets, that then hopefully allows us to invest in the reskilling of those individuals. I don't know that there's a direct route on that. I would like, though, Arthur, just to speak briefly about, you've spoken about workforce and workplace, and whilst perhaps it's more specific than to a general comment around digitalization, the impact at the moment of remote working, I think, is something that we have to be acutely conscious of, leaders and managers. So if I may take it into the specifics, we're seeing in conversations with our corporate clients, interesting comments. So particularly in some of the engagements that I've had recently, and I'm thinking here of professional services, I'm thinking of clients who are in financial services as well. It'd be interesting to hear from Michael if it's the same here. What they are seeing is that actually productivity has gone up. Now, it may well have gone up because people are spending longer at work. It may have gone up because there are less alternatives. We don't have the opportunity to get out and play quite as much as we used to. We're traveling less. And I am speaking here about a particular, our knowledge workers, as we might term them. At the same time, I would argue that the way that we are working right now is not sustainable for the medium run. So we've got to be quite careful that the way we think about remote working under COVID-19 conditions, I'm not sure that this is how we should be planning. And I'm hearing a lot of people saying, well, we don't need office facilities anymore. Everybody can just work from home. We have to think a little more about the psychosocial impacts of that. We have to also think about the costs that have been transferred to employees. And to me, there's an equity issue here that says where previously, yes, you might have spent money getting to work, but where previously you came to work, you had an office, you had access to certain things. I've had a number of CEOs who are working under much better conditions tell me how fabulous this home working is. By the same token, when you're sitting in an apartment or a flat, you are in crowded accommodation, you're trying to accommodate all of the things that we know about the homeschooling, etc. And suddenly you are required to find a workplace that is safe, to work in and be productive, I don't think things are quite as rosy across all levels of employees. So I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be embracing more dispersed workplaces. We shouldn't be using this to be, to offer more choice. But we have to think about what is the employee experience of this and what are the potential side effects. I see a comment coming through from Ella here, and she says work-life balance is a bigger challenge. Far more. And what we're also seeing is that we are likely, and this is a global finding, we are likely to take steps back in terms of gender equity, because it is, all things being equal, it is harder for women to access their work from home than men when you are in more gendered societies. So I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be embracing this. I don't think that we're ever going to go back to what was normal. I think there are positive opportunities and positive changes, but we really need to be staying close with our employees. I would also argue that a lot of the productivity gains that have been playing out in recent months are happening because of social equity that has been formed over months and years and decades. So the kinds of client relationships that we have, the kinds of internal employer-employee relationships, contractor relationships, whilst I'm not suggesting you can't build strong relationships in digital places, I think that those have been built over cups of coffees and glasses of wine and whatever it is that it takes to have sometimes the conversations that we have when we breathe the same air. And we need to be careful of assuming that we can just immediately flip into a digital mode and that kind of relationship equity lies intact.
Thanks, Nicola. That fits in well with what we've been observing, and also anecdotal evidence from many of the people we're speaking to, is that because they're not traveling between meetings or traveling to work, they have more hours in the day to allocate to other activity, but the result is that they're committing to far more meetings than ever before. So there's a sense of being more productive at this stage, but it is at the cost of mental well-being, because people are in fact working far harder in the knowledge economy than ever before. But from there, I'm going to start taking questions from the audience, and we've had some amazing questions come through. The first one is tailor-made for you, Iraj. It's from Fausta De Palma, who asks, what is your view on government bailouts in the sense that they create zombie companies and thwart the recycling of labor and capital? This may affect the speed of digitization conversion.
I think if bailout is, in the best of times, has been controversial. It depends what's the reasoning for bailout. If it's a cash flow situation that a business, because of a crisis like COVID-19 or some other situation, has a reason bailing them out and putting them back on some terms, strict terms, on commercial ground, that's not a bad thing. But if bailout is for a bankrupt, technologically defunct, managerially obsolete, commercially irrelevant business, then yeah, it's an absolute waste of society's resources. And we have a number of those, hundreds of those, in fact. We all know about some of the big national ones, but bailout in the public sector, obviously, entities is a lot more problematic, but there may arise cases of bailout in the private sector. A good example of it on the positive side would be back in 2008, 2009, when we had the financial crisis in Europe, as well as in the United States, but more so in Europe, a couple of major banks, such as the Royal Bank of Scotland, were rescued, were bailed out. But those monies were paid back to the National Treasury. There wasn't an abuse and it wasn't a bailout, a squandering of public resources. So bailout has got to have a rational basis. So I can't say I'm pro it or against it. If it's a cash flow thing, I'm for it, subject to conditions. If it's perpetuating inefficiency and extraction of resources by politically connected or corporate structure, I'm against it.
Thanks, Iraj. Question for you, Nicola, from Gavin Smith, who says, I see this move into a new world of digitization as companies empowering their staff to make better decisions by putting knowledge into their hands at the right time to facilitate better decision-making. Is that something that you're seeing?
I think it's been too early. I can't answer that, Arthur. But what I think is really important here, the question that we have to ask, and when I don't have answers, I always go back to saying, are we asking the right questions? So I think, Gavin, it's a good question. The question we have to ask, I think, is what is, I spoke about unlearning. What else needs to shift? As you digitize, what is it that needs to change? And specifically, when we start looking at authority, levels of authority in organizations, company culture, when we start looking at more decentralized decision making, and certainly what we see in a crisis like we're seeing at the moment, is that whilst we do look to leaders at the center to make some decisions very quickly under pressure, at the end of the day, the societies, the organizations that are going to work, I would argue, the best going forward are those that are going to be more decentralized, where high levels of trust have been built and accountability. So that goes to Iraj's comment as well, because part of the question about where do you want to not send bailout money is going to be to organizations where not only is there not a sense of accountability in the organization, but if individuals don't take on their own sense of personal accountability, you end up then, I would start arguing back to sort of the zombie point, you end up with zombie organizations where there is no decision making. So, that happens across the organization with meaningful work. So to me, the question is, when we start looking at the impact of digitization, the question we have to ask ourselves is, to what extent does the culture need to start transforming? And to what extent do we need to build the conditions in the organization under which we can operate at levels of high trust as well as accountability?
Thanks, Nicola. We're going to move to the international scene for a moment. Reginald Rumley, an old colleague of mine from my journalism days, wants to know what digitalization is going to mean internationally with regard to the domination of US multinational companies in key areas, or multinational monopolies, he calls them, like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, etc., and of course the Amazons and Amazon Web Services, who seem to be underpinning the digital transformation of the entire world. And Reg believes the pandemic will accelerate this. What is your view, Iraj?
I think that is only partially true. The fact is, digitalization for me, and I come from not a communication and social media and so on perspective. I come from an economic point of view. When I talk about digitalization of farming businesses, Google has got nothing to do with it. When I talk about digitalization in the mining industry, in the banking industry, Facebook hasn't got anything to do, except Facebook, yes, is a platform for marketing. It used to be Cape Times and Argus and so on. It's now Facebook or some other digital platform. So I think I wouldn't want to narrow digitalization to the communication sphere. There is a much wider, much deepening of technology that does not necessarily benefit those major American sort of multinationals. It's just changing the structure of the economy. So how much we can benefit comes back to public policy. If the public policy prevents or does not support or does not create an environment that gives birth to the entrepreneurship at the national or regional level, then yes, multinationals will benefit. Again, we've seen it in the past. In the age of industrialization, some countries moved quickly to get on the curve, so to speak, and they benefited from industrialization. Those who didn't, even up to today, they are dependent on some multinationals, whether it's a German or American or British or Russian, doesn't matter, from the industrialized age. So the extent to which digitalization will benefit the nations and the regions depends upon the speed with which, the clarity with which, the integrity with which national and regional policies are informed or driven by the changing environment.
Thanks, Iraj. Just a quick alert that we are now 3/4 of the way through the event. We have about 15 minutes left, so we won't get through all the questions. We'll cherry pick the questions. So apologies if we don't get to your questions. They're great ones coming through. Nicola just wanted to comment on that last topic.
I did, thank you. And it was perhaps more to put the spotlight back on Iraj, because I think that there are some interesting forces at play now. I think that one of them is the assumption that US multinationals are going to dominate. Could be counterbalanced by an assumption that says China is gaining dominance. And although it may well have suffered in terms of being country of origin effects regarding COVID-19, when we look at the domestic consumption and we look at the increased role of Chinese multinationals, I think it's a question of multinationals, but not necessarily US multinationals. The second comment that I'd make, and maybe Iraj wants to comment briefly, but is that we are seeing a rise in nationalism. I think we are also seeing, certainly in markets like the Eurozone, what we're certainly seeing also is this sort of awareness of the protection of the country. So we've seen borders close, for example, and as much as we may have gone cross-border with digitization, in terms of that physical real world, we've seen that happen. I think those also may be counterbalances to a US multinational dominance. So those are just two arguments, the China effect and the sort of awareness of national borders that may also counteract that. And Arthur, I'll leave it to you if you want to extend the conversation or not.
I'll move on to the next question. Iraj touched briefly earlier on the issue of access to digital goods, and it's a subject close to my heart because I believe there's a great need for digital democracy. And that leads to the next question, which is really for you, Nicola, from Nawal Ramasar, who wants to know whether disrupting the education systems and making broadband accessible to all, and I think those two go hand in hand, is a key priority.
So from my side, personally, absolutely. There's a question of access and delivery. On one hand, the issue, so for example, let me speak about the Gibbs situation that we found ourselves in. When the national lockdown first started, we stopped having face-to-face classes, but what we did do was we made facilities available. Sorry, this was just before the national lockdown. We made facilities available to a number of students who really don't have good access to connectivity or data at home. Once we moved into a national lockdown phase, our strategy in South Africa was starkly different to that of many of our peers. If you take a school, and I'm not going to suggest we're on a peer with Harvard, but we always look at Harvard. If you take a school like Harvard, they simply switched into Zoom. So the assumption was that you could have, that all of their students could access this kind of synchronous, high data intensive learning opportunities. We couldn't possibly do that. And as much as you may assume that students who are signing up for MBA, post-experience working, have this kind of access because of various national constraints, as well as the delivery or the access to the to data. We couldn't do that. So as we start looking at creating economies that can learn far more actively, there are multiple parties that need to come to the party, as it were. The one is in terms of being able to access the data. The second is that we've got to make sure that as much as we are changing curricula, and curricula themselves have to be changed to include these digital changes, and think about that, but that the universities and those providers of learning, other providers, come to the party in terms of making sure that these programs that are delivered digitally are not what we would refer to as paper under glass, and that you're simply signing up to receive a whole lot of material to learn in isolation. We learn, or we believe we learn better as in groups through processes of social discourse. So how you actually, as a learning institution, facilitate the learning becomes very important. I want to raise a third point, which is about the regulation of education in our country. And I'm going to speak specifically here about universities, because universities, as many of you will know, are governed by multiple regulatory parties, ultimately reporting to the Minister of Higher Education, but particularly the Department of Higher Education and Training and the Council for Higher Education. You cannot at this point as a university simply decide that you are going to take your curriculum online. We have a special dispensation now from the Council for Higher Education to take programs online because of the national lockdown. But the way things currently stand, there would be an expectation to take a program like our MBA that is registered for face-to-face transmission mode, and you would have to return to that. At the moment, we're looking at lags of anything from 2 to 3 to even longer years in the system to actually get those programs approved. So there, as I mentioned, there are multiple actors in the system who need to actually collaborate and come together. Yes, there is an argument perhaps for those who are thinking, well, people can just go online, we can all access LinkedIn Learning. There's a very important role for educators to play in terms of curating material. And we've seen it with our employees at Gibbs. They have access to enormous online learning resources, but until you can come through and provide badges of excellence or authority or approval, as well as making sure that learning material is relevant to your context, having an entire big shelf of books to choose from is not a substitute for having the right learning that is contextually relevant and delivered in time and in the right way.
Absolutely. There's a lot I can learn from Terry Pratchett, but it's not going to qualify me for the future. Iraj, a great question from Anelia Mtwesi. When we look at the high employment and low skill sectors like mining, automotive manufacturing, and the like, how do we ensure that people are kept in employment, especially when we take into account issues with reskilling?
Yeah, it's a very great question. I'll sort of literally every day we grapple with this. I think that speaks to a number of issues. Most importantly, the role of the unions. Unions got to change their thinking, their mindset, reimagine their roles to be more of a push, a drive, mobilization for reskilling of their workforce, re-engagement with the management to speed up reskilling on an ongoing basis. So that's one way. The second way, and very importantly, is that the economy cannot be dealt with in a disjointed way. For example, if we allow digitalization in the energy sector, as an example, I've done some work that suggests that much the same way that when digitalization started, Telkom SA 25 years ago lost 23,000 workers, and it was a big union pushback. It went for 3, 4, 5 years. Eventually they lost. Digitalization happens, cell phone industry established, about 280,000 jobs were created across the country. 23,000 lost, 260 produced. Today I submit, if our energy sector, with the help of the union, as opposed to with the pushback from the unions, if it's allowed to take digitalization and go away to modern technology, solar and other forms that uses great deal of technology, you will create something between 200 to 300,000 new jobs. They all won't be in Witbank and Midrand. They will be all around from Pafferty to Johannesburg, but there will be jobs. Now, that's just an illustration of the case that you cannot push back against what is inevitable to happen because you want to hang on to the known, and the known becomes more obsolete. So unions got to think differently, government has to think differently, and we got to take the technologies or digitalization's full impact on job creation and job destruction in totality, not keep some of it and allow the rest. In that case, we'll be able to mitigate some of the destructive impact on the unemployment or on the employment situation.
Thanks, Iraj. That's a really powerful message. Nicola, I'm going to put pressure on you and ask you to answer the next question in 2 minutes, which is real pressure, because it's actually 2 questions I'm combining. Wayne Diamond wants to know, despite digitization being the buzzword in first world countries, SMEs don't know how to get their business online for the basics like domains and email addresses. It's a very large learning curve with most SMEs who will battle with losing their jobs. And then the flip side of that question is from Eric Stillerman, who wants to know, to what extent are youth ready for the digital world of work, bearing in mind that many are tech savvy? So you have the 2 extremes. You have the SMEs who are not tech savvy, and you have the youth who are tech savvy. How do you balance the need to address both of those very briefly? We've got about 2 minutes to answer that question.
In a single answer, it's going to be, the answer is going to be segmentation, because you're going to have different groups of individuals who need different skills. And this is why we speak so much about learning paths, organizational learning paths and individual learning paths, not parts. So when it comes to which of those would I rather choose to fix or to address, in terms of the SMEs not knowing the path to go to try and digitize their business, I think that's a specific segment. We certainly do work on this at Gibbs. We work with groups of SMEs who require those, and I think there are putting in place those kinds of solutions, learning solutions, is not tricky. But again, you can't go and watch something that is targeted to an SME that is operating in the United States and assume that it's going to necessarily fit with the environment here. When it comes to youth being ready to engage in a digital environment, actually the biggest deficit that we find in terms of our younger students who, for example, are registered on a postgraduate diploma, which takes them straight out of an undergraduate degree, is not on the digital skills. It's actually on the social skills and how to form strong social relationships and engage and be able to navigate social circumstances. So it's this question of some of those human skills. And Arthur, I think I've taken a minute and a half because I saw a question that was also just around, does digital work better? In certain cases, when you need to know something in a hurry and it's very technically based, digital can be absolutely fantastic. When it comes, though, to forming deeper social relationships, when it comes to learning who, not just learning what, we find digital has limitations. So I've done 3 in 2 minutes.
Well done. If you could take a third one, are you getting better results from digital learning than physical?
So that's kind of the question that I'm raising here. What we're seeing is, provided you can design a curriculum into these kind of bite-sized chunks with something specific that somebody needs to know. So if we turn around and particularly also when they can practice, we need to teach you an aspect of financial modeling, for example. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do it better, actually, digitally, because people can learn at their own pace. They can try things again and again. With artificial intelligence, you can actually also develop algorithms that detect where your weaknesses are and hone back on those weaknesses. But when it comes to something like being able to hold a conversation where you can respect cultural intelligence, it's much harder because you're in an environment where you can't read body cues. When you're trying to teach a controversial issue and you want to look at the body language of your students to figure out how far have I pushed this, it's not as easy to do that online.
Right. And then the final question is from Carl Eschberger for you, Iraj. And I'm going to adapt the question slightly. Carl wants to know what influence digitalization could have on the flows of currency in terms of cryptocurrency, sidestepping the complexities of the currency market. So I also want to take that a little further and just ask what the impact will be of the digital evolution of cryptocurrency, blockchain, and the like on the evolution of the economy.
Yeah, I think there are 2 issues. Cryptocurrency, there is not a currency, technically. It's a misnomer. The technology behind it is very useful. Blockchain and so on, in terms of accountability and the track record of where the asset is originated, is very, very useful, and it's got wide-ranging implications and applications in the financial sector as well as non-financial sector. So I'm of the view that this notion of crypto, whatever, Bitcoin and etc., calling themselves currency, economically, it would have been absolutely disastrous if they were currency, because everything else would have just been devalued to nothing. So we need to put it as an asset class, and for some investors, as a part of an asset class, it's got a place in the portfolio, not for all the investors. And therefore, as the globalization moves to its next phase with the help of digitalization and technologies such as blockchain, we're going to have to define the nature of currency, find a new currency, or find a new framework based on the changing structure of the global economy. That game is only started. It's not the end of it.
Thanks so much, Iraj. Iraj and Nicola, thanks so much for all those insights. You've really helped us unpack the future and get a little handle on some parts of where it's going. We all know it's complex, but one can unravel some of it. One can get some signposts and some pointers to where it's all going. A lot of it's still shrouded in mystery. It's a little bit like a Facebook relationship. It's complicated. And I think that really sums up this entire environment. Thank you to the two of you for your deep insights, your fascinating insights into this environment. And thank you to our audience.